Hello, everybody. I wish you a happy new year, a lot of health, joy, luck, and a successful session in taking of the exams. Can you hear me? Great. Great. So we'll start. So today we continue with modeling in general, but we'll depart in the last two lectures from the main approaches that we have considered so far, the symbolic or classical approach and the connectionist approach. We discussed them in some detail. And of course, these two approaches are computational approaches. So the actual practice of this type of modeling requires using some computer environments like the ACTAR environment or some simulator of neural networks so that you can train conveniently and build models, especially in the case of symbolic type of modeling. And of course, it is something that requires time in order to get trained in doing so. But for a general cognitive psychologist, of course, the idea is to know the perspectives and what they bring to the explanation and the possibility of prediction related to cognitive processes. And of course, if someday you are going to do research, usually it's a teamwork, and within that team there will be people who are more related to experimentation, to designing and carrying out of experiments, and other people who are more involved in predicting what the results would be based on some theories, models, simulations, and so on and so forth. So what was central to connectionist and to the classical modeling was the notion of representation. Being a computational models, computation requires a representation in computational terms of some kind of structures that are assumed to be there when, for instance, a model of memory or of perception is performed. And we saw that the nature of representations is quite different for the classical and the connectionist approach. In the connectionist approach, it was related to the patterns of activations of the brain, related to the action potentials of real neurons in the brain, and the idea that everything is represented as patterns of activations, while the symbolic approach assumed that the activity of the brain, the structure of the brain, is something secondary, and that this biological machine, let's say, implements a very high level representation in terms of symbols, in terms of structures like schemas, scripts, with a specific structure, and that knowledge in general is represented in a propositional form, very abstract propositional form, that afterwards, based on rules, can be used in all the power of productivity, systematicity, and compositionality. So you can think of a language where you can basically say anything you'd like in an infinite number of ways. And after that, symbolic model actually follows. So you build these abstract structures, you build the procedures that act on them, and then your system must be can be used. And we saw the best example of something inspired by classical models, the ACTAR cognitive architecture, where at the basis you have the declarative memory with all the chunks, schemas, goals as specific type of chunks, and then the procedural knowledge that based on the goals actually makes use of all these mechanisms, the buffers of the various motor and sensor modalities, and everything else put together into a cognitive architecture. Of course, behind ACTAR, there were connectionist mechanisms like activation spreading, and also Bayesian learning mechanisms in order for the system not to be pre-programmed by a human modeler, but to learn what to do in certain situations, of course, based on what was already there. So some kind of declarative knowledge and some kind of procedural knowledge in the system. So now we go to something which is more modern. And even though we said that the connectionist approach is the approach in computational cognitive psychology, because of the recent progress in computation, in computers, and widespread, virtually everywhere usage of deep architectures in astronomy, in biophysics, everywhere you can use neural network, even in quantum physics, they simulate Schrodinger equation solution using deep architecture, so it seems a kind of universal computational method. But nevertheless, there are other approaches that, although they do not deny the idea that everything is kind of neuronally implemented type of architecture, nevertheless, there are other factors that have to be taken into account as well. So now we go to some general introduction to the dynamical systems approach, to embodiment, and we'll pay a little bit more attention to Barceló's theory of cognition based on reenactment of model states, which is a very influential new theory of cognition, which of course is related to connectionism mainly, but nevertheless, it assumes a very specific role of the neural circuits of the brain, and we'll see what exactly this theory is. So we start with the view of Hobbes. So these are general views. The dynamical systems approach actually came about much later than the two major approaches, the connectionist and the symbolic. So it was started to be formulated as even a revolutionary approach in the 90s, end of the 90s and the beginning of the so the book Mind as Motion appeared in 1992, and it was a book where there were various authors coming from the connectionist tradition, coming from a dynamical system tradition, who actually wanted to show a very, very different view of cognition compared to the view of classical connectionism and symbolic modeling. So in order to put into perspective this new hypothesis about what cognition is, there are these two views that were important to philosophers, the Hobbes view about the mind. So according to this view, computation is the basis of mathematics and might be the mechanism behind cognitive processes. Computation usually uses some kind of symbolic representation like numbers or more abstract structures. And so if this is the case for computation, probably this should be the case also for cognition. So actually, this first computational hypothesis is attributed to Hobbes. Cognitive agents are basically computers. So computation is what is important, not so much what kind of computation or how this computation is structured, but basically computation is something important. And therefore, this view is related to the symbolic approach in the sense that Newell and Simons' seminal paper published in 1976. And the main claim at the time that there exists a physical system of symbols, which is the necessary and sufficient condition for cognitive processes to exist. So this is, in a nutshell, the whole program of the symbolic approach. The idea is that we assume that this is the case, and now the idea is to find what is this physical system of symbols. So a computer is an example of such machinery that implements some kind of computation on symbols. And now the idea is to discover how exactly this computation takes place and give rise to cognitive processes. Then we have the so then we have Hume's view, and it's again a computational view, but it's more specific. So Hume's told that psychology must be based on mathematical laws, similar to the laws of Newtonian physics. So Newtonian physics is based on mathematics, of course, on calculus and other branches of mathematics, algebra. But actually, it's not sufficient to describe nature. You need to discover laws of nature. And knowing these laws, you can describe, explain, and predict what is going to happen in a natural environment. And so, similar to this situation in physics, the idea of Hume is that something similar must occur in psychology. So, some laws have to be discovered. So, for instance, like a loose analogy, gravitation can correspond to association based on some similarities. So, for instance, if two objects are close together, gravitation is stronger, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that somehow the laws of physics, the laws of matter, and the laws of mind must be connected because the mind is related to the brain, which is a physical system, although biological, but nevertheless based on the laws of physics. And therefore, somehow these laws are expected to be reflected in the mind as well. And so there are alternative views to Hume's view, which relate other computational processes, which are not exactly related to some specific law. So, for instance, connectionism we dealt with for a while is related to processes that are kind of analogous to what happens in the neural networks of the brain, or a kind of neural network that is always a candidate model, which is not a law, but it's just a way of learning, of processing patterns of activation. So it's an alternative to this view. And also in cognitive neuroscience and the dynamics of the brain, there are also models that are related, again, not to some specific laws, but to how physical laws implemented in the, let's say, action potential physics, the gates, neurotransmission, and so on and so forth, give rise to something that can be considered a computation that achieves some specific goals. And of course, you have other approaches as well as situated robotics and autonomous agents, where you basically have systems, artificial cognitive systems that can learn in an environment in a more situated way, so not based on some general laws or rules, but acquire the needed rules in order to achieve goals in a specific environment. And now we come to the so-called dynamical system approach. So this approach is inspired by, to some extent, of course, by what Hume has said, Hume's view. And there is one example which actually is very, very important. It's put forward by Tim van Gelder, one of the proponents of the dynamical system approach as a revolutionary new approach, different, distinct from the connectionist or the symbolic type of modeling. And so in order to explain his idea, what is the essence of the dynamical systems approach, he provides the example with the Watts governor. So the Watts governor is a device which is actually was used to control. It was at the time of the steam machines, and this device was used to control the speed of, for instance, some wheel that goes around, that revolves, and which can be related to some machine. So usually machine in manufacturing required constant speed of rotation. For instance, you can imagine some kind of tool that is related to such a steam machine that produces rotation with a constant speed. And the idea of the Watts governor is how to maintain a constant speed of rotation in such a device. And so the idea is that you have a specific device. So this is the equation that rules exactly how this will rotate based on steam pressure. But it's better to start with the device itself and explain how it works. So the idea here is that this device is related to the rotating wheel. So you see here the wheel, it rotates with the speed of the wheel. And so the idea is that when this rotates faster, you have the arms here that go apart. And if it stops, they go down to a rest position. So if it starts to revolve faster and faster and faster, they go up, due to the laws of physics, the laws of inertia. So the idea is that if you want to maintain a constant speed of rotation here, you must relate these arms to a device that opens or closes a valve and regulate in this way the pressure of the steam that comes into the system. So the idea being that depending, you can see the equation. So in the equation you have, for instance, the length of these arms. The mass does not play any role of the balls at the end of these arms. You have the angle between the arm and the vertical, and this is the velocity of rotation. The details are not important. So this is a differential equation solved about the angle. That is a solution to this problem. So the idea is that a specific angle here corresponds to a specific opening of the valve and the maintenance of some speed. So the idea is that maybe some changes can occur of the steam, of the pressure of the steam. So if the pressure of the steam goes up, then the speed of rotation will be faster. These arms will open and close the valve. If the pressure is lower than some limit, then the speed of rotation will go down. So these arms will go, these balls will go down, the angle will become smaller, and this will open the valve, so more steam will come out. So the idea is that with a specific choice of the length of these arms, you can have a system that maintains a specific velocity, although it's not an explicit control of the system. So the idea is that this whole device is a single system, and based on some parameters, the length, for instance, of these arms, you can maintain a specific system automatically. The idea being that any changes in pressure are quickly taken into account because the system reacts with a higher or lower velocity. This changes the position of the arms, and therefore it opens or closes the valve and compensates for the change here, maintaining a constant velocity. So automaticity, the idea that it's a single system without any explicit control of the variables of this system, for instance, the angle or the pressure or the opening of the valve. So all this somehow comes about automatically. You achieve the goal of the system. So the goal of the system is to maintain a constant velocity. And opposed to that is a standard algorithm, which can be thought to be a kind of solution to this problem within the symbolic approach, where everything is explicit and is related to some representations. So in this case, we have the variables, the speed of the wheel, and we start with a procedure that allows us, based on these representations, to control the speed. And the idea is that this is an algorithm which follows some steps. Actually, it's not a genuine process of a system, but it is something that is related, you see, to 5 steps that will lead to this result. So at first, you always measure the speed of the wheel, which of course, in reality is a process that can be discrete as well. So you can measure it each, I don't know, 100 milliseconds, for instance, or of course, it can be related to some measuring device that provides information continuously. Then you compare the measured speed with the required one. And if they're equal, this should remind you about the procedures, the production rules that have an if and then part. So here in the if part, you check the situation. What is the situation? So if the measured speed is equal to the required one, you just continue, go on measuring. But if this is not the case, else, you measure the steam pressure, you calculate the needed change in pressure to get the right speed, you calculate how much to close or open the valve to get the required change in pressure, and to change the position of the valve. And then you go there and you continue measuring. And so this algorithm, in a sense, can solve the same problem as the device, but the device works somehow automatically without any explicit steps and any discrete type of measurement, calculations, and so on and so forth. So this is the opposition between the dynamical systems approach that Van Gelder made. So the idea of something that functions as a system, and the behavior of this device in this case, or of a cognitive system, is because you have a system built, a system which is connected with the parts in a specific ways, and not because you have some kind of program step by step executed by the system which leads to the achievement of the goal. If you remember Akhtar, the examples that we considered, for instance, counting, addition, or retrieval or answering a question related to semantics, were stepwise, although this stepwise process is not that controlled. So this is the opposition. And the idea is that dynamic systems or dynamical systems are actually the framework in which the mind must be modeled. And the criticism of the dynamical systems approach against mainly the symbolic approach, but also to some models in the connectionist tradition, is related to the fact that there is no evolution in time. There is no this interconnectivity of a system that leads to some change in time. And this change in time, as with the governor, can be some equilibria. So, for instance, the speed that is required by supported by such system is a kind of equilibrium for this system. So we don't need to measure anything, just putting together the parts and running the system, it will have like as equilibrium this velocity that we want to achieve. While any other implementation, so for instance, if you imagine in the connectionist approach, you need some phases of learning, and some examples that you provide as input, and some reactions of the system that you expect the system to do, for instance, changing the position of the valve or changing the pressure and so on and so forth. So again, it's not dynamic in this sense. It's not a system that controls itself by virtue of the interactions among the parts, which are already set. So this is the different spirit of this approach. So what is a dynamic system? The idea of a system is that it has parts which form a kind of whole. So of course, they are not so completely separated dynamical systems in nature. There is always some kind of interaction, but in general, we can separate with some kind of approximation systems that are more or less independent on other systems, if you wish. So one favorite example, of course, is the solar system, which is subject to gravitation, to electromagnetic forces from other stars and the galaxy, black holes, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the main dynamics, the main behavior of the solar system can be explained by considering the sun and the planets revolving around the sun. And the idea is that you cannot take some of these parts away without destroying the system. So this is a kind of check if some part is related to the system. And there is this famous saying that the system is not equal to the sum of its parts. Sometimes it is said that the system is more than the sum of its parts, but this is not the original statement. And what is behind this statement? It's not a statement related to mysticism. The idea is that parts interact, and this is related to the definition of a part. If you can take away a part without the behavior of the system changing, that it means that this part didn't interact with anything within the system. So actually this added value, if you wish, or this different behavior of a system compared to a sum of parts is the interaction among the parts. And you saw that in the governor, Watt's governor, the idea is that the parts are mechanically related, and the opening of the arms of the spindles is related to the opening of the valve. So it's a connected system by mechanical connection, which actually leads to the behavior of this system in time. So a dynamical system, you have studied dynamics as part of physics at school, and there are statics and dynamics, and dynamics is related to systems that change in time. So the equations about the variables, so in physics it's usually position and velocity, depend on time. And in order to specify a system, you need to specify the position and the velocity at specific moments in time. And this actually is related to a system being dynamic, changing in time. Then such a system can have states. So if it is a body that moves in the space, these are specific positions and velocities of the body associated with these positions. So all these positions form as the so-called phase space or state space of the system. So all the possible, for instance, positions in this state space that the system can occupy or go through. And then you need some kind of equation when you have the initial position in state space. So if you know the initial position of a body and the initial velocity of the body, then, for instance, knowing the forces, you can calculate how this body will move in this space. But you need a specific equation in order to calculate this. And this equation is provided by the law of physics and the way you calculate the change into these variables, position and velocity. Sorry for the title in Bulgarian. So the state of the system, actually, these are the values of the interdependent variables. We mentioned in physics, for instance, in mechanics, it is position and velocity. So if you know usually it's in a three-dimensional space, so you need 6 variables. So these are the 3 coordinates for the position and the 3 components of velocity for the velocity. You actually have a state of the system within this simple example. For a cognitive system, as we'll discuss later, this could be the activations of some layer in a connectionist network. You remember that in the long-term memory model of McClelland and the co-authors, we considered a hidden layer as representative of what is at the input, and we saw how via learning these representations, they are changed in time. So we can consider them as variables that characterize the learning process and follow this dynamical process in time and see how we reach this classification of the inputs that was needed in order to produce the right output there. So equations are these evolution rules, and we saw here the equation that is provided here. So it concerns the only variable. This is the angle between the arms and the vertical, and it depends on the gravitation, of course. This G is the acceleration in gravitational field, and some other dependencies of the specific device. And if you solve this equation, knowing the position of the arms, at some point you can see how they will change in time and see what will happen with their position and velocity. So we expect something like this for a cognitive model, some type of equations that will have the same properties. And I suggested what is done, for instance, in one of the most popular dynamical systems model right now, which has almost the status of the connectionist and the symbolic approach, the so-called dynamic field theory, where actually activation is the variable over fields. And you have specific equations similar to the spreading activation equations of connectionism, but in real equation, differential equations, which are to be solved in order to see how activation evolves over such fields and is interpreted as perception, working memory, long-term memory at various levels. So the idea is that such a dynamical system, changing in time, is characterized by the state space. See, here. So the state of the system is related to the values of specific time and is a point in state space. And actually, the state space has the dimensions of the variable. If you have 6 variables, we have a 6-dimensional phase space or state space. If you have 8 nodes in the hidden layer and you take them as features of the system or variables of your system, it will be an 8-dimensional space and so on and so forth. So your system is a point at some particular moment in time, is a point in this state space, and then it moves in a trajectory in this space, and this is the behavior of the system. And hopefully you can find some kind of structure in this phase space, for instance, equilibria, where the system goes and stays, and so on and so forth. So all these are attractors. That these points in space, special points in space, are called attractors, and attractors are also part of the machinery of the dynamical systems approach as a modeling approach to cognition. So for instance, reaching a decision or recognizing an object or classifying an object sometimes is modeled as an attractor that is reached of the system. So the system changes, provided some input, and then settles down at some specific state. So the activation stops changing. So this specific state where the system actually ends is called an attractor, and you can interpret this attractor as, for instance, a choice or a classification. And then, of course, the behavior, as we said, is a kind of motion within the state space of the system, which can be, of course, very abstract. Some of the modern neural networks can have thousands of nodes, so it's a several thousand dimensional space, which cannot be actually visualized. But nevertheless, we can think that our system evolves in such multi-dimensional space. And this evolution, this motion within this space, this is a kind of abstract motion, actually has places where it can end up, stop, or places where it turns away faster, and so on and so forth. From this point of view, the cognitive processes are emergent expression of interacting variables. So you can imagine the nodes of a neural network or the neurons in the brain as interacting with each other via the synapses and the various mechanisms of interaction among them. And the idea is that something emerges out of it, out of this interaction, because it's a system, and this system can have very, very complex behavior. And the idea would be that this is something that models the mind better than assuming some symbolic structure that are transformed into other structures or combined in a certain way, step by step, and so on and so forth. And so this motion in space give you the intuition about dynamics because it's always moving, it's always related to other stuff, but nevertheless is constrained in some way, and there is some structure that actually makes this evolution structured, and you can really see what is going on. And this is more or less the intuition behind it. If we are to consider such a model, we need to consider equations, how they are solved, and so on and so forth, but this is out of the scope of this course, of course. We are more speaking about the dynamic system perspective. And this perspective of dynamics of the system actually leads the representatives of the dynamical system perspective to consider that actually cognition is related not only to the brain as a system, but also to the environment. And the environment is not, as in the models, we consider something that, for instance, in ACTAR, there is a buffer that if we want to know what is in front of us, we have a procedure, production, that asks the model buffer vision to fetch us what is in front. So it is encoded and we can use it afterwards. And then if we want to change something in the environment, we can actually have a production that sends a command to the motor buffer and the system executes something, then we can use the visual buffer in order to see what is the result of this action and so on and so forth. So again, everything is stepwise. So the idea here is that this interaction with the environment is not just a discrete input that is processed at steps, at discrete steps, but actually it's part of the larger system between our body with the sensors and the muscles that can execute motor commands and the brain. So it is an interaction as in the what's governed. So it's not separate. It's a kind of whole system that influences, which, whose part influences each other continuously without any separation. And so this is the novelty of this view. So we don't have this major idea within the connectionist approach and the symbolic approach that you have some input from the environment, somehow represented in some patterns, and then they are processed and so on and so forth. No, here the idea is that it's a kind of whole system that acts as a whole without this separation of input output. And of course, this actually makes central the interaction, the consideration of a system, brain, body, and environment as the basis for explaining cognitive processes. So if we miss this systematicity, the idea that this is a whole system, we miss some important parts in cognition. This is the claim of this approach. And of course, the idea of these sensory motor aspects of cognition, which are completely neglected in the symbolic approach, sometimes are neglected in the connectionist approach, depending on the models, are put at the center by the dynamical systems approach. Of course, if you have the body that is always there in cognition between environment and brain, then of course you have something called embodiment of cognition. The idea that the body and the specific interaction with the environment allowed by the structure of the body, if you wish, somehow influences in an essential way cognition, the representations, if we believe that they are representations, or anyway, the functioning of this tripartite system, which should explain cognition. So embodiment stresses that condition depends on the sensation coming from various modalities of the body, visual, tactile, auditory. Uh, Knowledge is not, so we don't have this clear separation. We have a structured world out there to be perceived. We have a perceiving system, for instance, the mind via the brain, some receptors and actuators. And then we perceive the world, we encode, for instance, as patterns of action potential, we use them. Our mind works on these patterns, and then it undertakes some actions, and then the actions are just executed in the environment. So this very mechanical view of cognition is challenged. And one of the first book within this dynamical systems approach tradition is the book by Varela, Thompson, and Roche. This is Eleanor Roche, that you know from categorization models, called The Embodied Mind. Of course, this embodiment here is kind of anti-representationalist, and it's more to the enactment approach. The idea you can act in an environment without thinking, if you wish, without representing, and without this mediation between sensing something and acting. This is supported partly by neuroscientific data. So some people would claim that about 30% of the neurons directly connect sensory to motor parts of the brain without any representations or interpretations. But of course, this is something that is still to some extent under investigation. It's a very interesting domain. So here is to see more or less the theories of the mind that we are dealing with in the course. So we basically stressed very much the right, if you look at the graph part of this diagram. So this is the representationalism part. And we discussed that this is kind of sustained by the patterns of activation in the brain that can be measured and correlated with cognitive processes in a very stable way. So this supports that there is something in the brain and therefore probably in the mind that stands for something outside in the world. So this theory can go to various branches, so computationalism that we more or less related to the cognitive revolution, the idea of the Turing machine that can compute in algorithmic-like fashion anything that can be computed. And from there, we can go to embodied cognitive science, where the idea that within this kind of representation in computation, the body is very important and we need to take into account the body, the structure, and everything else. So a branch here is the good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. Usually this is, how to say, it's not something good to be said about artificial intelligence. So neural networks connection is not there. This is more these old symbolic approaches based on logic, based on structure that are not popular anymore. Neither in cognitive science, neither in artificial intelligence. And then you have the idea that there are no eliminativism is related to the idea that there are no representations. We can think that there are, but there are none. And then the idea is that how exactly then the mind can work. And you know, for instance, the ecological psychology of Gibson, the idea that you have all the information about categories, natural categories in the environment, so the mind can directly extract them from perception without the need of some representations. Behaviorism, which basically denies, at least methodologically, the right to speak about representations in the black box, and so on and so forth. And this can lead to the so-called radical embodied science, which doesn't go through any kind of representations, but it's more about functioning of very complex dynamical systems, as we said, the body, the environment, and the brain that function in a certain way without supporting representations. But the behavior of humans, these people would focus very much on behavior. The behavior of people can be interpreted as if they had representation, but according to these people, they do not have. So it's just something that is in the behavior, but not actually in the explanation how this behavior occurs. And there are many examples that we don't have time to just to sense how what exactly they mean. So, for instance, if we are in a jungle or in a savanna environment, and we see some antelope start running at some point, and then we see a lion, we can interpret it that actually the antelope sensed, smelled that there is a lion, understood that there is a lion, and therefore actually activated some production to run away because there is danger related. So it's a representationalist account of what is going on. So these people from the eliminativist type of view, they would say, okay, the behavior suggests to us humans that there is this process going through a representation of a lion, of danger, of action that has to be undertaken. But otherwise, maybe it's just a specific smell that makes the antelope run, and that's it. There is nothing else. But the sophistication of this behavior is such that we kind of anthropomorphize this behavior by actually inventing representations and the process of thinking that probably is not there at all. So it is possible to have a very complex and structured behavior without representations. So there are many examples and evidence that the body plays a decisive and essential role in cognition. For instance, some research shows that the gestures we are making when speaking are kind of part of language. And vision actually changes by our movement. We see better when, for instance, the objects that are around our hands, uh, or if we expect that some object is coming close to a body part, our attention and vision adapts to be more precise and fast for this region. So actually, this is relation of vision to the body. The mirror neurons that actually allow for at least primates and humans to recognize actions performed by others. So they have specific neurons that fire when others perform some actions. And some cognitive tasks are also more effective if the body or external objects are used. You know that sometimes we need to write something down, to point to something, and so on and so forth. And there are other processes that depend on the whole body and not only on the brain. For instance, in modern robotics, there is a branch which is related to how to build the body of the robot without any computer, any mind, so that this robot can, for instance, avoid obstacles, not fall down, actually keep its equilibrium, and so on and so forth, just by virtue of the body parts, of how they are shaped, and so on and so forth. And of course, the idea that sensation and action uh, is the basis of what we can think about. So without this physical experience, there will be nothing in our thoughts, according to this approach. And so there are also famous books and people who actually made this the first steps in this direction. So some of the most famous is the conceptual metaphors and cognitive processes in the book Metaphors We Live by Lekoff and Johnson, where the idea is that our cognition is based on a few conceptual metaphors, for instance, like space, the idea of life as a journey, or the idea of our thinking as a kind of recipient, a place where we put our thoughts and our feelings, and so on and so forth. And it can be traced in many cultures, how the language reflects actually such physical metaphors about space mainly. And time is conceptualized via space usually, so the life is before us, the past is behind us, and so on and so forth. So up is good, down is bad, and many others that are part of culture and of course of cognition. Then we have the enactment cognition theory, the embodied mind. We mentioned already Varela, Thompson, and Roche, where the idea is that we have a kind of, as in the Watts governor, kind of structural connection between brain, body, and world without representations. So we function in a very structured way, but not because there is this input output idea. And there are other approaches like the approach of Brooks, where the idea is that you have simple robots that learn specific tasks and they kind of self-organize in order to achieve the task without any central representation of the task, without any goal, and so on and so forth. So one of the most recent, not this book of Andy Clark, but nevertheless, Andy Clark is a philosopher who actually is a proponent of this view uh, related to action, relation to doing things in the world in real time, and not about thinking and representing and memorizing. Ecological perception is also one example how this can happen. If we believe that the stimuli from the environment actually bear what is needed for cognition, you don't need to sustain yourself everything that represents this environment. And of course, the dynamical system theory. So Teleny Smith are very famous authors. Smith, she's a developmental psychologist from Indiana University, and she deals with cognitive development of children, young children, and tries to explain how children learn to walk, for instance, or do particular tasks by interaction with the environment, by trial and error. And Van Gelder, we mentioned, and Spencer Schoener are the creators of this modern, let's say, framework within the dynamical system theory, which is called dynamical field theory. And this is, again, as I suggested in the previous lecture, you can see the program and proceedings of the cognitive science conferences that uh, take place once a year, and see symposia and workshop based on, for instance, the dynamical field theory approach, which encompasses cognitive development, memory, various systems of memory, decision making, and there are also cognitive robots based on this theory. So the idea of the embodied cognition, which is very, very influential today, this is maybe the most, how to say, fashionable, although there are opponents to this type of theories and models. And the idea is that many characteristics of cognition strongly depend on the characteristics of our bodies, which play an important causal role, uh, or are parts of the cognitive processes. So the body can also function as a constraint to knowledge. For instance, we cannot represent, for instance, things that we cannot do because our hands or arms can be limited to certain movements, and the movements that we cannot perform are not represented, for instance, and therefore when we reason about the completion of a task using our hands, we'll be limited to what our hands can do, and not, for instance, a mechanical hand that can have all the degrees of freedom to do. So it's a kind of dispatcher of cognitive processes or a regulator of cognition. So, for instance, the body as a constraint, mm, the idea is that some forms of cognition are easier and natural, and vice versa. Some forms are not so easy and unnatural. For instance, logical thinking is quite difficult for people, while doing something in an environment is something natural because we are adapted to this environment. And The differences in the cognitive processes can be explained by the variation of the body influence of the conceptual metaphors, like the spatial metaphors. Color perception is also interesting related to categorization, but also to emotions. Palmer is a famous neurophysiologist, and in his recent research, he relates which curve cause for instance, positive or negative emotions. And the colors are related, for instance, to the environment, to things that are related to our life in an environment. And for instance, blue is something that is kind of leading to positive emotions, while yellow is leading to negative emotions. And the explanation is that it's related to situations in life that involve these colors that are happy or not that happy for us, and so on and so forth. Uh, so the body as a dispatcher, the idea is that the body structure is very important. So one naive idea, for instance, while walking, one idea would be that your brain controls all your movement and how you keep equilibrium. But according to some views and robots that are built without any minds, the idea is that the body can be built in such a way that it can be very stable without falling. And the idea would be that you have two systems. The system of walking is separated for the brain, so it doesn't load the brain with this task, but the brain kind of supervises this system. And this is a kind of division and dispatches of resources so that your brain is not involved in any aspect of, for instance, action or motion. Some of them are just made by separate systems and mechanisms. So this is related to this morphological computation, how exactly our bodies are actually built by evolution, and also the bodies of animals, and just the shape of the body solves some tasks that otherwise we would be kind of attributing to cognition per se, but it's solved by the machinery of the body. and by evolution, of course. It's not something that is mystical in any way. Okay, and so we have some time. I try to be fast with this initial part of the presentation. And in the time that remains, we'll consider a theory that more or less was formulated, the theory of cognition, in the 90s. And actually, the major papers appeared after the year 2000. And this is the theory of Barceló, which is based on what he calls simulation, situation conceptualization, and prediction. And this is a paper that will be uploaded in Moodle. It's a very easy to read paper, very clear paper. And of course, I'll be happy if you read it, because this is a very influential research and theory by Barceló that is used in cognition in general, in language very much also, and is very interesting, not so, let's say, close to what we have considered so far. So it part can be seen as something related to connectionism, but on the other hand, it has the pretension that it explains symbols, symbolic structures, and it's a general theory where the claim is that it explains everything about cognition. So what is important about this theory? The idea is simple in general. We have these parts of the brain that process information coming from the various modalities, from vision, olfaction, and so on and so forth. And while we kind of represent this by activating these parts of the brain, the idea of simulation is that these parts can actually simulate, although nothing is present in the environment. We cannot see a chair, but we can simulate a chair. And the idea of Barceló is that it's so general a mechanism that it is at the basis of cognition. We simulate in a kind of perceptual form everything, not only perceptual, but also sensory motor form. For instance, if it's a chair, some actions are natural for a chair. For instance, move the chair from one place to another, sit on the chair, and so on and so forth. This also will be part of this simulation, but of course, not always the same, but depending on the context, depending on what is needed right now. So simulation is central form of computation. So it's a computational approach, but this computation is related to internal simulation. That is the first thing that occurs in the mind. And then we have some kind of symbolic representation or whatever. So the simulation, by definition, within this theory is reenactment of perceptual, motor, and introspective states acquired during experience with the world, body, and mind. So this simulation can be related to what happens in the world. It can be related to what the body does, related to some actions, but also it can be internal. When we think, we introspect about something, we recall some feelings about we experience affective states. They can be simulated. So it's a kind of very interesting theory. And it has two phases. So the first is the storage in long-term memory of such multimodal states. So these are not schemas. These are not just any kind of patterns that can be kind of activated by some mechanism, as in the connectionist approach, where the internal patterns are kind of arbitrary, sometimes meaningless. They are abstract representations of something. While here, the idea is that you encode states that you can simulate afterwards. So for instance, see the chair, see a bicycle, simulate how you ride a bicycle in Central Park or wherever, and so on and so forth. And they are related to something that is perceived or acted or introspected. So then once you store this, and these storages of such information, they, of course, with experience, they become more and more elaborated, detailed, with various aspects, and they can be not just one about the same object, but many of them. And then you have a partial reenactment of these stored long-term memory structures uh, in later representational use. So when somebody tells you, okay, there was a chair in the room, you simulate a chair. And if it's a room, you simulate a room. A chair in the room, you simulate something. It can be related to your experience or something more general, even not consciously simulated, but it is always there. This is how cognition works. And based on this mechanism, you can understand what you perceive, you can understand what people are saying, but of course, you can predict what is going to happen, which is a very important characteristic of the mind in modern theories, that the mind is very much about prediction of what is going to happen. And so, introspection here is not the introspection of what is the standard meaning of introspection. The idea is that apart from this perceptual and action information that you can simulate, you have something that you felt, some affect, the motivation of doing something, your intentions, some metacognitive information that is also there, that also is part of this type of structures that you encode. And afterwards, you can simulate situations related to what you're interested in, chair, a book, or a concept. So the storage of model states, the idea is you should be reminded of what we said while discussing the perception. So once again, it's close to the model of Huber and Wiesel, to the neural network models or the connectionist model. The idea that the perceptual system is based on feature detectors that are hierarchically organized from very simple detectors of very simple features to detectors that have larger fields and combine many features. And so you have this information, you have this state, these spiking patterns or whatever, and then you somehow memorize them. Afterwards, you can reproduce them, simulate as if you are perceiving what you had perceived before without it being present right now. So the example of Barcelona is related to a bicycle. Mine was related to a chair, but it's the same. So in visual processing of a bicycle, neurons, there will be some detectors of some edges, surfaces, color, configuration, motion, and so on and so forth. They will fire. The object will be represented by these activation patterns across a hierarchically organized distributed system. And similarly with other modalities, if you touch your bicycle, if you kind of have some feelings about your bicycle, and so on and so forth, all this will be represented by some pattern of activation and will be encoded into something that afterwards can be reenacted when you think about bicycles in general. Even if you read a book about bicycles, this part of storage will be reenacted because this is the way you would understand what you're reading. So you have the actions together with this, you have the effective reaction. So everything that you can think of is somehow encoded in this way that allows afterwards a simulation, as if this is something that you perceive right now. If when this feature system becomes active to represent an entity or event, you have conjunctive neurons in association areas of the brain that somehow combine all this into something, into a structure, so that you can use it afterwards as some kind of representation. But this representation is not an arbitrary pattern, it is not a symbol, which is also arbitrary, but it is something that is related to your experience. And so you have this population of conjunctive neurons that call the patterns in a distributed way, connectionist way, where each neuron can participate in more than one representation. So it is not a kind of store model of memory where you have places for everything. No, this is the brain with a lot of neurons, and each of them can participate in various representations, which afterwards, based on the connection, for instance, or other mechanisms, can bring about the pattern that is related to what we're dealing at some moment. And so, of course, the idea is that you can have also locality, the visual, the olfaction part, the tactile part. You have some pattern, but then via the association areas, they are kind of combined. So you have a high association areas in the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes that integrate this information across modalities. So you have all the information packed in some way. So then you have the second part of the model, the reenactment part. So this was what the system stores, what are the representation of the system. So these are kind of sensory, motor, plus affective and whatever information related to some specific experience that is packed and of course built upon when new experience comes to you. And then when you use this, the idea is that you reenact this model state. So they are model related to vision, related to affection, related to all the modalities. So you reenact them as if to some extent you experience them again. So if you reactivate these feature patterns that have been stored, you don't need something out there, perception of it. They can be reactivated in thinking. So you close your eyes and you think of something that you have seen. So you use this reactivation to actually think about it and analyze it and so on and so forth. So, for instance, the bicycle model, you have associative neurons that partially reactivate the visual state, active during its earlier perception. Actions performed on the bike are also partially reactivated by the association neurons, and they reconstruct the motor state. So, for instance, if you analyze the brain, you see that the parts related to, for instance, riding will be activated to some extent. Of course, you're not going to start to move your legs as if you are riding a bicycle, but nevertheless, activation in the brains will be discovered if somebody measures when you think about the bicycle. These are part of the evidences that support these approaches. The brain, direct analysis of the brain, these sensory motor areas of the brain are active when you read something about the bicycle or think about the bicycle. This is, of course, important. So, according to Barso, reenactments are always partial and potentially inaccurate, but reenactments are always like the original model states to some extent and serve as representations during cognitive activity. So they can be unconscious, they can be very vague. Nevertheless, this is what supports cognition. So unconscious reenactments may occur frequently during perception, memory, conceptualization, comprehension, and reasoning, along with conscious reenactments. So the idea is that it's kind of known that most of the processes in the brain and in the mind are unconscious. So according to Barso, this type of storing such multimodal descriptions and the reenactment partial of this is a basic process. This is what is going on in the mind at the basic level. So when reenactments reach awareness, they can be used as constituting a mental imagery if it's a visual information. And of course, you can hear some sounds as if you are reconstructing a song and so on, or sounds, and also the feeling of touching something and so forth. So the main constructs of this theory, these were the basic processes of the theory, are the so-called simulators and simulations that we discussed already. So the simulators are instances of a category and typically have statistically correlated properties and activate similar neural patterns in feature systems. So it was the explanation of McClelland about the formation of semantic memory, that objects, events, whatever out there, there is always a combination of features which is stable. And basic, these correlated properties are the basis of semantic knowledge. So here this is used at the level of the simulators, the building of what Barcel calls simulators. So similar populations of conjunctive neurons in associated areas tuned to this feature conjunctions should typically capture specific patterns. And after experiences a categories instances over time, a distributed multimodal system, this is the simulator, develops to represent the category as a whole. So he generalizes this idea of stored simulations uh, for the case of a category, something more general where many instances can, many chairs, many bicycles, somehow they are superimposed in something that he calls simulator, where you have together the instances, but also some representation of the category, if you wish, some kind of averaging over some characteristics and so on and so forth. So this simulator actually stands for a concept or general type, objects or events, by integrating multimodal content. So it's still related to the modalities of perception or action of a category across instances, and by providing the ability to interpret a specific object or event as an instance of a concept. So the idea is that looking at this particular chair, you activate the simulator, and the simulator is providing you with a sense of the category. This is a representative of the concept chair, something like this. So, of course, not all of the details are completely clear, and there is no, to my knowledge, computational model that implements it. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting framework. And actually, this paper specifically presents how a model has to be built. What are the structures? What are the processes? And how they function in all aspects of cognition. So, for instance, the example of Barcel or bicycle, the concept is represented by a simulator. Across encounters with different instances, so different bicycles, visual information about how bicycles look becomes integrated in the simulator, along with auditory information about how they sound, somatosensory information about how they feel, motor sequences for interacting with them, affective responses to experience them, and so on. The result is a distributed system somewhere in the brain that accumulates and integrates the model content over encounters with various bicycles and forms a kind of category that is represented in a multimodal fashion. But of course, anything related to, for instance, to a bicycle is also related to the parts of the bicycle, like spokes, mesh, pedal, effort. So you have other such simulators that stand for instance, for pedals or for mesh and so on and so forth. So a simulator representing a category can reenact small subset of its content as specific simulations. And simulations are unconscious, but some aspects can become conscious, as in mental imagery. And all content in a simulator never becomes active simultaneously. So according to him, the simulators are very rich. You have a huge amount of information that is somehow represented, but it's very context sensitive. Depending on what your focus is at a particular moment, only parts of it can be activated. And of course, it may remind you of how you retrieve partial information in a symbolic mode. So there, it's completely different. You have a description, for instance, of the concept of chair with some information about the typical length, where chairs usually stand, how many legs they have, and so on and so forth. But based on what you need at a particular moment, so for instance, sit on a particular chair, only part of this information will be activated because the other part is not needed for achieving your goal. But this is a completely different framework that, as I said, has the ambition to actually replace the symbolic approach, although it kind of sounds similar to this approach if you change symbolic representation with this type of simulator representation based on multimodal representations, if anything. So the bicycle simulator might simulate a touring bike on one occasion and mountain bike or cross bike on others, because all the experience content for bicycle resides implicitly in bicycle simulator. So this is something very, how to say, this assumption is quite strong, assuming that you have such structures in the mind that basically have all the information about something. And they can be somehow activated partially. So diverse subset can be reenacted on different occasions and tailored to specific context. So context sensitivity is a very important problem in cognition, and it's one of the main problems of artificial intelligence, how to make robots context sensitive so that they know what is appropriate in specific context, which is something human can do easily. While if you want to understand how exactly it is done, you encounter the problem of infinite information in the environment. And so simulations may represent specific instances of a category, so they also somehow uh, can have information about individuals' instances within categories. So it's a very rich structure that they have everything inside. So what it is, nobody knows. But it's sensory motor based cognition completely. Simulators and simulations perform a wide variety of functions. Simulations represent the instances of a category when it is not physically present, so when you think about it, during memory, task, language, and thought. Simulations produce inferences and predictions about perceived instance of a category using a pattern completion inference mechanism. So it's part of the mechanism we discussed in the beginning that any model has structures and also has mechanisms. So here the structures are the simulators and the simulations. Uh, Part of the mechanism, of course, is how this information is stored. It's a kind of learning, but then how it's reenacted. And here the focus is on the high level. When you see something, how exactly these simulators and simulations help you do something. So, for instance, if you see part of a glass, this can activate a simulation of a glass, so you can basically infer that this is a glass if actually they match. And also, if it's an event, and so you have a simulation of this event or of the category of events, for instance, going to a restaurant, by this internal simulation, you can predict what is going to happen at a particular moment by a kind of pattern completion. So in the scene that you see, there is missing information, but in your simulation, this information is available, and you can transfer it to what you observe at some point. Okay, so simulations stand for this proposition in the symbolic approach that underlie this type token predication and complex propositional structures that we discussed in the symbolic approach or in ACTAR, if you wish, where you posit them to exist. Well, here the idea is that you learn them, although this process of learning has not been modeled, but nevertheless, it's hypothesized to happen within these simulators that kind of learn information from what happens around us and stack it so that afterwards it can be reenacted and used in various tasks. So simulations also can represent abstract concepts. And so the idea I think that there are some slides on abstract concepts, which is the difficult questions about this approach. So it's easy to say, okay, when I see a bicycle, I'll understand what it is, I'll be reminded of how I ride it, and so on and so forth. But what about democracy? And the answer of Barcelona is that even though democracy or freedom or whatever are kind of abstract concepts, nevertheless, they are related to more complex type of such simulators that, for instance, can involve some events that are related to democracy, for instance, some kind of demonstration or some events that are related to standing for some rights, and so on and so forth. Elections, how elections happen, or some scenes from the national assemblies, and so on and so forth, that form the concepts of for instance, freedom or democracy. Basically, according to Barso, the mechanism is the same. So in general, simulations implement the functionality of classic symbolic systems, with this functionality emerging implicitly in model and association systems rather than being represented explicitly in symbolic structures as in predicate calculus and frames. So this is the ambition of this approach. It says we don't need the symbolic approach. Actually, it is something that will emerge out of the approach based on simulator and simulations using sensory and motor information as a basis. So what are the sources for these simulators to be learned? So according to Barso, there is an infinite number of simulators. They can develop in long-term memory for object settings, events, actions, introspections, properties, and so on and so forth. So a simulator develops for any component of experience that attention selects repeated. So this is his idea, context sensitivity. Only important elements of the environment that attract our attention will be encoded in this way. Of course, if we need everything, we'll encode everything. So when attention focuses on a type of object or action in experience, such as bicycle or pedaling or whatever, a simulator develops. So such flexibility is consistent with the proposal of Shins and co-authors that the cognitive system acquires new concepts when they are relevant, as they become relevant, not just in general that this knowledge available. So selective attention is something very flexible, and actually simulators can develop for anything that attracts our attention. Okay, and of course, our internal type of cognitive processing, when there is no external experiences, is believed to be of exactly the same nature. Anything related to our internal experience, thinking, feeling, or being in a certain state can be encoded again based on our sensations and what we do, the actions in our minds, or some kind of thinking, calculation, logic, whatever is also a type of activity or actions that are performed. So, for instance, when you see a mathematical problem, you might want to solve it or think if it's an equation that, for instance, you need to separate the variable that is unknown and so on and so forth. So the idea is that uh, the focus of this internal type of simulators is more related to introspection and also to events that we can reconsider internally. Okay. And now we come to this idea of situated conceptualizations, which is really a cornerstone of this theory. So the idea is that usually concepts like a chair or a bicycle are not thought of in isolation, but are related to some kind of situations, background setting, or events, or some feeling about them. And actually, whenever you perceive something, usually you perceive the context, what is around, people participating. And therefore, when you encode information about concept, usually they are situated and not isolated. So this is something very, very important. So across different occasions, diverse situated conceptualization can represent a category, like riding a bicycle, repairing a bicycle, enjoying riding a bicycle, and so on and so forth. So this is an important characteristic of the model. And so we have four basic types of information uh, in order to form something like this. So these are, first of all, the perception of relevant people and objects that are related to what you're interested in, the actions that you perform, the introspections related to it, how you feel about it, for instance, and some kind of settings. So it's a kind of multimodal simulation of a multi-component situation with each model component simulated in the respective neural system. So visual information in the visual system, tactile, and so on and so forth. Okay, and now we'll briefly mention some more, let's say, advanced notions of this model. In the paper, everything is very well explained. So entrenched situated conceptualizations are very important. So this is this knowledge that somehow comes from repeated situations. So in the symbolic approach, we will say that this is kind of schema that actually fires when we are in this situation at the unconscious level. So something that we experience every day, for instance, in situations that repeat daily. So the idea is that over time, the situated conceptualization becomes so well established that it becomes active automatically immediately when the situation arises. And then the idea of the mechanism inference via pattern completion is such an entrenched situated, uses such entrenched situated conceptualization that support the pattern completion process as an automatic process. So when you make sense of a scene, or for instance, you see a chair, you see a kind of table, you see some food on it, so you can think, okay, it's a kind of restaurant or something, or it's time for breakfast or something like this. So this is a kind of pattern completion that comes from something automatically brought to mind. Sense. So on encountering a familiar situation, an entrenched situated conceptualization for this situation becomes active. And so this is the mechanism how we interpret what we see or feel or hear, and so on and so forth. So this model, so in this paper, Barso explains how his framework, theoretical framework, can be used and is supported by experiments in perception, action, implicit memory, working memory, conceptual processing, and language. And for instance, in perception, because when you observe something, you have an internal simulation going on in order to understand the process. The internal simulation can influence what you perceive. Probably you know this McGurk effect, where you see a mouth pronouncing something, but the form and the way this mouth actually moves is for a particular sound, for instance, ba or whatever. But then you hear another sound, and because you expect something different, you basically perceive an average between the actual sound, the actual pronunciation, and the one that you'd expect from your internal simulation. There are also experiments with color perception, where you learn some association between a letter and the color. And when it's presented in a different color, you have a kind of averaging of the color of what is expected and what is actually seen. So we perceive something in the middle. So this is taken as an evidence that you have an ongoing internal simulation at the perceptual motor level. So in action, the idea is that the perception of object leads to the prediction of what actions can be performed with these objects. And there are also examples in the paper. Implicit memory is also something very interesting. The idea that somehow perceptual information can form a kind of subconscious form of memory that actually influences perception. There are some expectations that are formed. They support the idea of internal simulation. So in working memory, what, for instance, you consciously can represent like mental imagery can be viewed as the conscious and explicit manipulation of simulations in working memory to predict future events. So you imagine something, but it's part of the simulation going on that becomes conscious, and based on that, you infer what is going to happen. So similarly for conceptual processing, when entities and events are categorized, conceptual knowledge about the respective categories becomes active in the form of simulation to predict what is likely to happen next or what should be there as part of what you observe. And also in language, the idea is that the prediction is the basis of language comprehension, as the task is the main task is to predict what you hear means, what the language means. So similarly, based on what you hear, you have this simulation of speech and what this speech meant on other occasions that is available to you, and therefore this process is facilitated. Okay, I think that's all, and this is the end of our lecture. So I hope that you are interested enough to read the paper by Barcelona, and Have a nice day. If you have questions, you can ask them now or you can ask them in the forum. Yeah, so there is a question. Okay, okay, great. Have a nice day and bye.